Good morning, men. Thanks for being here, men and ladies. We continue our study in the book of Genesis, and we are in chapter 25. Chapter 25 of Genesis, where we continue our study this morning. As I mentioned last week, a large section of the book of Genesis that we've been studying deals with the very famous patriarch Abraham, a really important character in Bible history. And we've been studying about events in his life. And now we are just bringing that to a close. And in the first part of chapter 25, Abraham is going to pass from this life. Before he does, we learn a little bit more information about his life. Chapter 25, verse 1. Then again, Abraham took a wife, and her name was Keturah, and she bare him Zimram, and Jokshan, and Medan, and Midian, and Isbak, and Shuah, and Jokshan. And then it goes on to describe some of those, the descendants of those sons of Abraham. And so there were kind of an interesting, although we don't really, that's all that's said about it. We remember that when Isaac was born, Abraham had said that, he was too old, and certainly Sarah was too old. And God miraculously renewed in them the childbearing capacities. And what seems apparent is that when he restored that to Abraham, then that stayed with him. And he fathered other children, not by Sarah, but by this wife, Keturah. And so we know then that he has other children. The only ones that he had prior to this time, Ishmael and Isaac. Now he has several others that are named there. Now, the author asks us to describe the difference in how he treated Isaac and these other children. And we get that information beginning at verse 5. Abraham gave all that he had to Isaac, but to the sons of the concubines which Abraham had, Abraham gave gifts and sent them away from Isaac his son while he yet lived eastward into the east country. Now notice there's a little bit more, sort of just a hint of information there. Notice he had sons by other concubines, plural. So it mentions a wife in verse 1, but it mentions plural concubines in verse 6, by whom Abraham had sons. And so apparently there's a fair number of these other descendants of Abraham, but he gave his inheritance to Isaac. It says that he gave gifts to the others and sent them away, but he gave his inheritance to Isaac. Isaac was the son of promise, and we've been talking about that for the last several weeks. Through Isaac would all the promises God made to Abraham be fulfilled. And so there's the information. Verse 7, these are the days of the years of Abraham's life, which he lived 115 years. So 160, 3 times 20 would be 60. And 15 to 60 would be 75, so 175 years. We remember he was 100 when Isaac was born. So you get an idea of the age of Isaac then at his father Abraham's death, 75. Then Abraham gave up the ghost and died in a good old age, an old man and full of years, and was gathered to his people. That's just an expression that's used several times in the Old Testament about dying, being gathered to his people. But there's actually an implication there that some have drawn from, and that is that there is an existence beyond the grave indicated by the expression gathered to his people. If his people, let's talk about his deceased ancestors, right? If his people just died and ceased to exist, then that expression wouldn't make any sense. Gathered to whom? There is nobody. When his ancestors died, they were dead and it was all over. They ceased to exist. This expression wouldn't mean anything if that was true, right? And so the expression is an implication toward an understanding of life beyond the grave. You know, sometimes people argue that in the Old Testament times, especially early on in Old Testament times, people didn't have any idea of the life beyond death. And that just simply is not true, and this would be an indication that they had that understanding. Some have taken that even further to try to make a point in the answer to the question, will we recognize each other after this life is over? In other words, if we make it to heaven, pray we make it to heaven, will we know one another when we get to heaven? That's a real interesting question, and good Bible students take both sides of that question. I've taught on it before, and we've studied about it before, and I'm of the conclusion that we will recognize one another in the life beyond. There's some problems with that view, but I think that it is a more consistent answer than saying, no, we won't. Now, the big question is, so, wouldn't it be something, assuming that's so, wouldn't that be something to be in eternity and see Abraham? Be able to talk to Abraham, of all things, be able to talk to Abraham. Can you imagine that? You know, that to me, that's one of the things that makes the notion of heaven thrilling. That these great Bible heroes that we've studied about all our lives, they're going to be there. And if we are able to be there by God's grace, we'll be there with them, and we will be able to see them, know them, be in their presence. That's incredible to me. The big downside to that position is, well, there's supposed to be no tears in heaven, right? There's not supposed to be any sorrow or grieving in heaven. But what happens if I get to heaven and I realize that my wife didn't make it? How could I be happy in heaven if I realized, in other words, we're recognizing each other up there, and I see a lot of people I know up there, but the one person I'm especially looking for is my dearest loved one, my wife, and she didn't make it. So I'm going to have this eternity of grieving because my wife didn't make it. I think to me, that's the downside to the position, will we recognize one another in heaven? My answer to that is, and I don't know if it's a completely satisfactory answer, but my answer to that is, in heaven we'll have perfect knowledge. We'll understand everything completely. Right now, our thinking and understanding is limited by our feeble mortal capacities. We just can't grasp it all. In heaven, we will see it all. We'll see it perfectly. We'll see God's justice. We'll also perfectly see His grace and mercy. And so, my explanation is I don't think that we will grieve because we will understand. We'll see it from God's perspective perfectly, and therefore that it will not be like we would grieve here. We're measuring that by human experience, and the human experience will be over and we'll be in a whole different realm. And so that's how I would answer that objection, although I'm not sure that that's a completely satisfactory answer. Any thoughts or comments? Just a little bit of a side note relative to that expression that Abraham was gathered to his people. Monty?
The Bible tells us that God will take away all tears in heaven. So if we do recognize each other, however that works, God's going to fix it. If our dear loved one isn't there, God's going to fix it for our minds, or however that works at the time, where we're not going to grieve, we're not going to be tearful, we're not going to mourn it. Like you say, we'll understand it somehow or another, but He's taking care of it. He's going to make it that wonderful place for us. And however He takes care of it will be sufficient for us.
I think you're right. Other thoughts or comments? All right. So he's gathered to his people. Verse 9, and his sons Isaac and Ishmael buried him in the cave of Machpelah. Well, that's where Sarah was buried, right? So they buried him where Sarah was buried, in the field of Ephron, the son of Zohar the Hittite, which is before Mamre. The field which Abraham purchased of the sons of Heth, there was Abraham buried, and Sarah his wife. So the author had asked, who comes together at the time of his death? And obviously Ishmael and Isaac. Interesting that it doesn't mention those other sons who were named earlier in the chapter. Now that, I don't think that necessarily precludes the possibility that they were present. The significant ones present were Ishmael and Isaac, who came together to bury Abraham. So the author asks us to summarize the importance of Abraham. The last question on page 14 of our study guide: explain the significance of summarize the importance of Abraham in God's overall purpose. What would you say about that? The importance of Abraham. How would you summarize that? Anybody? Monty?
He's referred to as the father of the faithful. He's shown us a process whereby he grew. We can see it earlier in his life, mistakes he made, but he grew past it to the point that he was willing to offer Isaac his son. And so we can see that we may not always be the strongest in the world. He's a good example for us of growth and faithful service to God. And
Okay.
we can be considered faithful even possibly when we're still young in the faith and got a long ways to go, because he was considered faithful. And it was accounted to him for righteousness that he believed God. So, but at the same time, we see he still had growth and did it, and we have that example for us.
I think that's a good thing to observe for sure. In James chapter 2, verse 23, he is called the friend of God, which is really and that's by inspiration, right? That's not just Abraham making that claim, but by inspiration, he's identified as the friend of God. So he's a great man, a great Bible character. As Monty said, the example that he set, we can learn from. And it wasn't all 100% positive. It was very, very good. The example of Abraham was very, very good, but we talked about some of his letdowns, a few of his failures. We can even learn from them. I think he learned from them. And so, there's a lot to learn from Abraham. I would also say that the importance of Abraham in the overall story of God is that it was because of those promises made to Abraham, beginning in chapter 12 of Genesis, that God made promises to Abraham. A great nation would come from him, that his descendants would possess the land of promise that they did later on. Significantly, especially significantly to us, is that through his seed would all nations of the earth be blessed, which was a promise of the Messiah. We benefit from the fulfillment of that promise, that through his seed would all nations be blessed. We are among those blessed because of the seed of Abraham. You think about it, really. So we started reading about Abraham at the end of chapter 11 in Genesis. So only a few chapters of the whole Bible story had been recorded before Abraham shows up on the scene. So Abraham shows up in chapter 11, and really beginning right there and on through the Bible, we're reading about Abraham's descendants. Now there are plenty of other people mentioned. But the Bible is a history book, but not a general history. It's not the history of the world. It's not the history of Eastern civilization. There's a lot of history there, and there's histories of various people and events. But primarily, the Bible history is the history of Abraham's descendants, and that is significant. And so he is certainly an important player in the whole Bible story. Any other thoughts or comments, Jacob?
But also, God's not just only dealing with Abraham at this point, and he's not afterwards either. People still have obligations to serve God, even though they're not covenant with Abraham in this story. We should read about Melchizedek with Abraham before, so they were understanding. You go on farther, you can get to Isaac, and the Egyptians understand certain principles of God's laws about adultery and so forth. So there is still a responsibility to God by all, not just Abraham.
Exactly right. Like I said, it's a history of God's dealings with Abraham, but like Jacob said, don't assume that means therefore God wasn't dealing with anybody else. We know he was dealing with other people. I think one of the great examples of that in the Old Testament is the story of Jonah. Jonah was sent to the Ninevites, Nineveh was the capital of the Assyrian Empire. And God sent his messenger Jonah to Nineveh to tell them to repent. God was obviously still dealing with other people. What we have recorded here, though, is primarily his dealing with the descendants of Abraham. Tom?
You know, as you grow up in the church or religiously, you know, as a child, you have a perspective that sort of this Israel, the land, you know, the Holy Land is just immense place that God took over. And it's the center point of the world and everything. And then as you become older, you come in, you see that really God basically just took a microscopic portion of the whole world to bring everything into play and draw into play. And Abraham's sort of that focal point. He starts out with the whole world, he comes in, he focuses on Abraham, and then it crosses, and then everything sort of opens back up, you know, to his whole plan for eternity.
Okay.
So Abraham is at sort of crossroads in the history of why we believe and what we believe, and the whole concept. If it wasn't for Abraham, you know, nothing makes sense.
Yeah, okay. All right. Dale?
Greg, when we're talking James, there you know about faith and works. You know, I never really thought about it. Do you think of these heroes in the Bible, Abraham, Noah, all of them, the walks that they made, the faith that they had in God, that couldn't increase our faith in God. You know, nothing, because we'll see some of the things they did. You know, just like Gideon, you know, for instance, just one man, and his faith in God that he's going to prevail. It's like Abraham offered Elijah, you know, that's something that we can't hardly wrap our heads around, you know, just some of the things that these heroes in the Bible did. So it should increase our faith.
I think so too. I think that, you know, if you think about it, God could have revealed his will to us a different way. He could have just miraculously said, here are the rules. And just, you know, gave us a checklist of rules. And we are made to understand you must live by these rules. He didn't exactly do that. He did give us his instructions. But his instructions are all mingled together with the lives of individuals from whom we learn. And we see their relationship and their interaction with God and the things that God told men to do. It's much more effective, wouldn't you agree? It's much more effective to learn, like we learned about Isaac. I mean Abraham. We're going to see it again here in Isaac. When Abraham lied about Sarah being his wife, that really registers. I can see that. I can connect with that story, and it really helps it register in my mind. Whereas if the Bible just said, "Thou shalt not lie," okay, I understand, don't lie, but it's sure that story of deception on the part of Abraham really hits home, doesn't it? Makes it easier to comprehend and relate to. Dale?
We often tell people, we don't live by the Old Testament, but, you know, we take it out of the Bible and carry it out to other places.
Think what we wouldn't know, yeah. Think what we would not know. And really, not only would we not know, we'd miss out on valuable moral lessons. I think that's exactly right. Jacob?
That's a very good point, because that makes Abraham's faith even more impressive, because he didn't have these examples to go by. If God tells us to make a big sacrifice today, and we do it, we look at Abraham and say, well, God's always blessed people to make sacrifices for him. He keeps his promises. Abraham didn't have that to go on. It's a statement of this, how incredible his faith was.
Exactly right. Exactly right. Dan?
What you're referring to as far as a checklist, I always think of a checklist within information security. You know, a checklist is a horrible thing because it instills complacency. You know that, hey, I've done the bare minimum of what's required, and I don't have to step outside my realm.
So if you just give a checklist, there's nothing to push you to do more.
Right, because I have to check the box and I'm done.
Good point.
That's all I need to do.
Good point. All right. All right, thanks for all those good comments. Abraham, a great Bible character for sure. All right, so we're still in chapter 25. Let's skip down. We're going to skip a few verses here, some of the names of the descendants. And we're going to skip down to verse 19. These are the generations of Isaac, Abraham's son. Abraham begat Isaac, and Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah to wife, the daughter of Bethuel the Syrian of Padan Aram, the sister of Laban the Syrian. And Isaac entreated the Lord for his wife because she was barren. And the Lord was entreated of him, and Rebekah his wife conceived. And the children struggled together within her, and she said, If it be so, why am I thus? And she went to inquire of the Lord. And the Lord said unto her, 2 nations are in thy womb, and 2 manner of people shall be separated from thy bowels. And the one people shall be stronger than the other people, and the elder shall serve the younger. All right. So we learn one thing here, that Rebekah had been barren, unable to conceive children, and Isaac entreated the Lord, it says, and the Lord answered, so he prayed. His prayer was answered, and she conceived. She conceived twins, and she felt that there was in her pregnancy. Obviously, us men can't conceive that, but you women who have had children might understand better than we do about something made her understand that there was something wasn't normal. Something funny was going on in her womb. And the scriptures says that the children struggled together within her. That's all I know. I don't know more than that, but enough so that Rebekah felt it was not normal. Now, she hadn't had children before either, but she may have talked to others. I mean, I think easily she could have talked to others and said, what I'm feeling, is that normal? And other women who had had children, maybe even other women who had multiple, like multiple births, twins, I said, no, I don't think that's normal. That doesn't seem normal to me. I don't know. And so she asked God about it. And an answer was given to her. A prophetic answer was provided to her. That 2 nations were in the womb. 2 manner of people shall be separated from thy bowels. The one people shall be stronger than the other, and the elder shall serve the younger. So the prophetic answer given to her was from these children that she's about to bear. 2 nations of people will descend from these children. They're going to be different in nature. One will be stronger than the other, and the elder, that is the descendants, the nation that descends from the firstborn, will serve the nation that descends from the secondborn. Okay? So that was prophetically mentioned. Now, our author asks us to compare this to Romans chapter 9. Let's go to this. This is kind of an interesting question. We get challenged about this from time to time. In Romans chapter 9, let's begin at verse 10. Romans 9, verse 10. When Rebekah had conceived by one, even by our father Isaac, for the children being not born, neither having done any good or evil, that the purpose of God according to election might stand, not of works, but of him that calleth, it was said to her that the elder shall serve the younger, as it is written, Jacob have I loved, but Esau have I hated. Okay, now, of course, the elder shall serve the younger. That's where we've just been reading, right? Where verse 13 says, it's written, Jacob have I loved, but Esau have I hated. That's from Malachi. You might make a note in your margin. That's Malachi chapter 1, beginning verse 1 through about verse 4. What about this? Now, the reason why this gets brought up is it is used as an attempted proof of predestination and foreordination. That God chooses who He's going to love arbitrarily. It even says they weren't born yet, having neither done good or evil. Even before they were born, it it was said to her, the elder shall serve the younger. Now it was not said before they were born, Jacob have I loved and Esau have I hated. That was said much later. But it was said that the elder shall serve the younger. Does God love some people and hate other people just arbitrarily? Because that's what the Calvinist wants us to believe, right? The Calvinist wants to believe that some people are chosen for salvation and other people are rejected arbitrarily from birth. You are either among the chosen and the elect, or you are not. And they would use this text to try and justify that position. Now, go over with me to Malachi. In Malachi chapter 1, it says, the burden of the word of the Lord to Israel by Malachi, I have loved you, saith the Lord, yet ye say, wherein hast thou loved us? Was not Esau Jacob's brother, saith the Lord, yet I loved Jacob? And I hated Esau and laid his mountains and his heritage waste for the dragons of the wilderness. Whereas Edom saith, we are impoverished, but we will return and build the desolate places. Thus says the Lord of hosts, they shall build, but I will throw down, and they shall call them the border of the wilderness, or wickedness rather, and the people against whom the Lord hath indignation forever. You see you see the context of Malachi chapter 1? He's not talking about Jacob and Esau as individuals. He's talking about the nations that descended from them. And I think that's especially borne out when it switches from talking about Esau to talking about Edom. The Edomites were the descendants of Esau. And so that text where Jacob have I loved, Esau have I hated, is a statement of God concerning the fact, I loved the nation of Israel, and I did not favor the Edomites. The Edomites came to be pagans, right? They were pagan idolaters. And so God loved Israel and he hated Edom because of their wickedness, as is mentioned in that text. And so there's a lot there we're not going to dive off into all that's being discussed there in Romans chapter 9. But just be aware of the fact that it's used there. God loved Jacob and hated Esau. God chose Jacob and did not choose Esau. The elder shall serve the younger. It's talking about the descendants. Right? It's talking about the nations that descended. It's not talking about the individuals. And so my whole point in that is, if you're talking to someone and they say, you're either chosen or you're not chosen. Look at Jacob and Esau. That's not what that's talking about. That's talking about the nations that descended from them. Any thoughts on that? Monty?
In this particular context here, when he's talking about before they're born, even God's made a choice. God has the ability to see the future, to know how we're going to be, our character, and what kind of choices we're going to make, even from the parent here, the moment of conception, even probably from the beginning, before the beginning of the world. God could look into the future and see how these people are going to be. He had particular character traits he wanted and that he knew that Jacob would have, that he put whatever value on, and chose him to be the one that the lineage was going to be brought down to. But it wasn't unusual for God to do that. When David was chosen to be king, when Samuel went, he thought it was going to be the oldest son because he was a big, fine, good-looking man. And God said, no, you're looking with man's eyes. God looks for things differently. So God was choosing based on the character that he knew that they would have and whatever qualities that he used to choose by. And not just because Esau was firstborn, but because Jacob would be obedient and Esau was rebellious.
Yeah. I think your point is exactly right. I think I think this is something that we really have trouble connecting to. Because we are we're bound up in time, and we think totally cause and effect. If you knew, for instance, that if you were 100% certain that tomorrow the stock market was going to jump by 1,000 points, and there was this one particular stock that tomorrow You know for certain, there's not even any shadow of a doubt, it's absolutely positively certain that this one particular stock the value of it's going to multiply 5 times in one day tomorrow. It's going to happen. Well, if you knew that for sure, then you would react to that information, right? And you'd get every bit of money that you could lay your hands on, and you'd buy that stock up tonight, before the opening bell tomorrow. So if you know the future, you're going to react to what you know about the future. That's the way we are, because we are beings of time and space. We're confined by time and space. God is not. And the thing that's different about God that we can't even grasp, I think, is that He can know the future without causing the future. You know, the question is always asked, does God know right now whether I'm going to go to heaven or hell? Well, I don't know whether God chooses to know that or not. I think He can, because I think God can know all things, past, present, and future. But if He chooses to know, if He does know whether I'm going to heaven or hell, He doesn't bring it to pass. He can know the future without causing the future. That's just something my pea brain can't get a hold of, because we are, again, different from God. We are bound here in time and space. We think cause and effect, and that's not always the case with God, who is eternal. Dale?
Very long view of what you might have said. You know, the writings of Malachi actually brought time back. So even though they kind of stress back to this writing of Genesis, they knew the outcome. So
Yeah, as you say, those statements were made after the fact, not before the fact. Okay. All right. Tom?
You know, when it comes to heaven, God has told us the requirements to get there. And He's provided us all the information to get there. But a lot of times our attitude and our pattern of life and the choices we make in life hinders us following that path. The same thing was with, you know, if you go back and you look at God's people all along, God gave them the roadmap. They decided to take a different way somewhere along the line. Sometimes He allowed them to get led back. Sometimes He didn't, because they just got so far off track they couldn't find their way back. Look at the differences between Judah and Israel. Judah, tried to follow God. A lot of times when God beckoned them and gave much, they repented and turned back. Israel got to the point where they never did, and they went their way, and God didn't bring them back.
Okay.
So
right.
We have that same thing. It's that road path. Sometimes we just don't want to follow. We want to go our own way. We want to do it our way, and that's the way I sort of look at Jacob and Esau. They both sort of took their own path, and one of them just took the path where he couldn't get back. Even sometimes he tried, but he didn't try the things that really worked. He tried the things that he thought would work. Jacob went through and did things and repented and turned back to God and followed God that way.
Okay. All right. Jacob?
The fact of the matter is that God did choose Jacob and not Esau as the one that the promise was going to go through. But it's not, it didn't ensure their salvation. Romans chapter 10, all the months says the Israelites, they didn't do what God chose them to do. God chose Jacob, the promise was going to go through him. It wasn't anything that Jacob had done to deserve it or earn it, because it was before he was born. God has chosen today that He's going to save people who have faith and obey Him. It's not anything that we've done to earn that position. It's just that that's what God has chosen. That's what He's saved. But He's loved the whole world and made it possible for the whole world to be the one that He's chosen.
That's right. In other words, God, as you said, God chose Jacob to be the one through whom the promised lineage would pursue. But that didn't exclude Esau from being able to be blessed by God too. But Jacob was the son of promise, just like Isaac was the son of promise. For those of you who just came in, we're in Genesis chapter 25. Genesis chapter 25. So what happens when they're born? Beginning verse 24. I'm in Genesis 25 at verse 24. And when her days to be delivered were fulfilled, behold, there were twins in her womb. And the first came out red all over like a hairy garment. And they called his name Esau. And after that came his brother out, and his hand took hold on Esau's heel, and his name was called Jacob. And Isaac was 80 years old when he bare them. And the boys grew, and Esau was a cunning hunter, a man of the field. Jacob was a plain man, dwelling in tents. And Isaac loved Esau because he did eat of his venison, but Rebekah loved Jacob. And Jacob sawed pottage, and Esau came from the field, and he was faint. And Esau said to Jacob, Feed me, I pray thee, with that same red pottage, for I am faint. Therefore was his name called Edom. And Jacob said, Sell me this day thy birthright. And Esau said, Behold, I am at the point to die, and what profit shall this birthright do to me? And Jacob said, Swear to me this day. And he sware unto him, and he sold his birthright unto Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau bread and pottage of lentils, and he did eat and drink, and rose up and went his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright. All right. And again, that story is well known to us. Obviously, Jacob and Esau were twins, but not identical twins. They were fraternal twins. They had much different physical appearance, as is described there. We read about parental favoritism. Sometimes we talk about if I was going to mention a Bible character and the problem of parental favoritism among children, who would you name? Joseph was favorite of Jacob, right? So the one with the parent that we usually blame with parental favoritism is Jacob, because he was distinctly favoring Joseph just a little bit later on here in the Bible story. But his father and mother had shown parental favor. So Jacob may have learned that parental favoritism from Isaac and Rebekah, because it is spelled out there. The part of this that's significant is that Esau sold his birthright. What was the birthright? What was the birthright? Anybody? Tom?
That was sort of a double portion given to the oldest, or one that was supposed to inherit. And that was sort of the way that they dispersed inheritance back in those times.
Yeah, the firstborn would basically become the next patriarch. The firstborn would inherit the headship of the family and a double portion of inheritance. Our author gave some references there. I like especially Deuteronomy 21. In Deuteronomy 21, if we begin the reading at verse 15, if a man have two wives, and one beloved and the other hated, and have borne him children, both the beloved and the hated, and if the firstborn son be hers that was hated, then it shall be, when he maketh his sons to inherit that which he hath, that he may not make the son of the beloved firstborn before the son of the hated, which is indeed the firstborn, but he shall acknowledge the son of the hated for the firstborn, by giving him a double portion of all that he hath, for he is the beginning of his strength, and the right of the firstborn is his. And so there, later, when laws of inheritance are being made under the law of Moses, the right of the firstborn is seen there. So Esau comes in from hunting. He's hungry. And he asked Jacob to feed him. And Jacob says, I'll feed you, but I want you to sell me your birthright. I want you to give me the right of the firstborn. Esau, pretty clearly here, Esau doesn't care for that at all. That's not important to him. You get the idea that he didn't have any respect or regard for that privileged position which he held in the family. He says, I'm about to die. Give me something to eat. Yeah, you can. What, you have to think, he couldn't have been that close to death, right? He could have scrounged up some food for himself, but his birthright was so insignificant to him. He said, sure, I don't care. You can have it. Just give me something to eat, will you? And he did, and that's going to come to play, right? In this family history, it's going to come to play that he sold his birthright, and his disregard for that, which was really an important thing. The privilege of birthright was really an important thing. And then over in Hebrew, Esau is mentioned in Hebrews chapter 12. In Hebrews chapter 12, verse 4, chapter 12, beginning verse 14, it says, "Follow peace with all men and holiness, without which no man shall see the Lord, looking diligently lest any man fail of the grace of God, lest any root of bitterness springing up trouble you, and thereby many be defiled, lest there be any fornication or profane person as Esau, who for one morsel of meat sold his birthright. For you know how that afterward, when he would have inherited the blessings, he was rejected, for he found no place of repentance, though he sought it carefully with tears." So the Hebrew writer calls Esau a profane person. Some of you may be reading a newer translation. Is there a different word in a newer translation? Godless? Godless, okay. I think especially the word has the idea of not regarding special things, not having appreciation for that which is special, even sacred and holy. This birthright, and the birthright, by the way, not only carried the significance for Esau of a typical family, but in this case would have carried the significance of these promises to Jacob and Isaac. And he didn't care anything about that stuff. That was just not important to him. And so he's called a profane person because he didn't, as Yancey said, another version calls him a godless person. He didn't have regard for important, significant, sacred, spiritual things. He was a profane person, the King James says. And we see that. I just think those several verses that we read just sort of ring out with how he had no regard. He just didn't care. And we've got to be careful lest we have that attitude about that should be special, sacred, holy. We can't just say, it doesn't matter. I'm not concerned. I'm not interested. Esau did, and he can pay the price for that as time goes on here. Notice, even here, the name Edom is attached to him. And so we know that his descendants will become the Edomites. I'm always sometimes I have to really apply myself to remember the connection of these descendants. And there's three that stand out here, I think, in what we've studied so far in Genesis. The daughters of Lot, remember, bore sons by incest to their father. And they became the Ammonites and the Moabites. Those two were the descendants from Lot by his daughters. And here we read about the Edomites. Well, we read the name Edom. They've come to be known as the Edomites. And so in Old Testament history, when we read about the Edomites are the descendants of Esau. So as I said, I sometimes challenge to keep all those connections together, but that's where the Edomites will come from eventually. All right, it's a good stopping place. We'll stop right there. Now, in the next chapter, when we get to the next chapter, we're going to see Isaac imitating his father in regards to deception. We'll talk about that next week. Lord willing, we'll begin with chapter 26 next week.